They laughed at the man who carried no gun, only a small leather pouch of dried leaves, and by the next sunrise, every one of them would wish they had listened. The morning air in Red Hollow tasted of dust and black coffee, the kind that sat too long on a stove, bitter and burnt, while the first lights stretched across the wooden storefronts like a quiet warning no one noticed. Elias Crow walked slowly across the hard-packed street, his boots worn thin from miles of desert trail, his shadow long and straight behind him, his dark hair tied at the nape with a faded strip of cloth the color of storm clouds. In his hand he carried the medicine bundle, soft deer hide darkened by years of use, tied with careful knots, each one placed with purpose. People stopped what they were doing when they saw him, not out of respect but curiosity, the way folks watch a stray dog wander into town. Someone near the general store muttered something under their breath. Someone else chuckled. A hammer stopped mid-strike against a horseshoe. Elias kept walking. He always kept walking. Outside the sheriff's office, a young mother sat on the steps holding a pale boy no older than 8. His breathing shallow, his small fingers clutching her sleeve like he was afraid to drift too far from the world. Elias slowed when he saw the child. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce himself. He simply knelt, quiet as falling dust, and placed 2 fingers lightly against the boy's wrist, his eyes closing as if listening to something deeper than a heartbeat. The mother hesitated but didn't pull away. Maybe it was the calm in his face. Maybe it was desperation. From inside the office came the sound of boots on wood. Sheriff Thomas Hale stepped into the doorway, broad shoulders filling the frame, silver star catching the sun. Behind him stood Dr. Victor Langford, coat clean despite the heat, gloves tucked neatly into his belt like a man certain of his education. The doctor's voice came first, sharp and polished. "You planning to cure him with weeds and stories?" A few men laughed. Not loud, just enough. Elias opened his eyes, but didn't stand. "Fever runs like a trapped horse," he said quietly. "It needs a door." The doctor smiled without warmth. "What it needs is real medicine." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "We don't need confusion here," he said. "Take your tricks outside town limits." Elias rose slowly, brushing dust from his palms. For a moment he looked at the boy again, then at the sheriff, not with anger, not with pride, just a long, steady look like someone measuring the distance between 2 truths. He handed the mother a small wrapped leaf anyway. "Boil this in water. 1 cup. Let him breathe the steam." The doctor scoffed. "Or you could trust someone trained." The leaf fell from her hand into the dirt after Elias stepped away. No one picked it up. A breeze rolled down the street, carrying the smell of mesquite smoke and distant rain that wouldn't arrive. Elias walked toward the edge of town without another word. No defense, no argument, just the soft sound of his boots and the quiet rattle of the medicine pouch against his side. Behind him the laughter returned, softer now, uncertain, but still there. And above it all the sun kept rising, slow and patient, as if it already knew the morning had not finished teaching its lesson. The land outside Red Hollow stretched wide and quiet, 10 miles of dry earth and pale grass bending under a wind that never seemed to rest, and at the edge of a shallow arroyo where cottonwood trees grew thin and stubborn, Elias Crow lived in a cabin no bigger than 200 square feet, built from old timber and patience. The door hung straight. The roof did not leak. That was enough. Inside, the air carried the scent of sage and cedar, the kind of smell that settled into the bones and stayed there. Small bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters, tied with twine, each one labeled in careful markings only he fully understood. A kettle rested over a low flame, steam rising in slow white ribbons. Elias worked without hurry, grinding dried juniper berries with a smooth river stone inside a shallow bowl worn by years of the same motion. Outside, his horse shifted its weight near the fence, leather saddle creaking softly. He spoke to the animal sometimes. Not with words people would understand, but with the calm tone of someone who had learned that living things listened better than crowds. On a small shelf near his bed sat 3 objects. A folded army blanket, faded to gray, a tin cup with a dent along the rim, and a child-sized moccasin, carefully cleaned, carefully kept. His fingers touched the moccasin as he passed, not stopping, just acknowledging. The past did not leave him. He simply learned how to walk beside it. Years ago, before Red Hollow had a proper name, Before the rail surveyors passed through measuring land like it belonged to paper instead of sky, a white ranch family had come to him in winter. Their daughter could not breathe. Snow had sealed the trails. No doctor could reach them within 50 miles. Elias had gone anyway, through freezing wind, through waist-deep drifts. He had stayed 3 nights beside that child, feeding her steam from pine needles, keeping her lungs open with slow breathing taught to him by his grandfather. She lived. By spring they had moved east. No goodbye, no thanks. That was the way of things. Elias did not measure worth in gratitude. The kettle began to whisper. He poured the dark liquid into small glass bottles stoppered with cork, his movements steady, exact, as if each motion mattered. Because to him it did. Because life always did. A rider appeared far off on the ridge road, only a shape against the bright afternoon sky, then disappeared again behind the rise. Elias did not react. Trouble always arrived the same way. Small at first, quiet, easy to ignore. He stepped outside as the sun leaned west, the light turning everything the color of old brass. From town, carried on the wind, came the faint sound of a church bell marking the hour. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a screen door slammed. The world continued as if nothing had shifted. Elias lifted his eyes toward the distant buildings of Red Hollow, his face unreadable, neither hurt nor proud, only certain in the way a man becomes after losing enough to understand what cannot be taken anymore. In the distance, a dust trail began to form on the town road, thin at first, barely noticeable, like the beginning of a question no one was ready to answer. Dr. Victor Langford did not believe in anything he could not measure, and that belief had carried him 2,000 miles from Boston to this dry corner of the Arizona territory where he intended to prove that science belonged even in places that still believed. In desert spirits and old songs. His office stood beside the sheriff's building, white paint already fading under the relentless sun, the windows cleaned every morning until they shone like mirrors. Inside, glass bottles lined the shelves in perfect order, powders and tinctures imported by rail and wagon, each labeled in neat handwriting. A brass clock ticked on the wall, precise and unforgiving. Order, control, certainty. These were the things Victor Langford trusted. He was washing his hands in a porcelain basin when Sheriff Thomas Hale entered carrying the weight of a father's worry hidden behind a lawman's posture. Daniel lay on the examination table, his breathing uneven, his skin flushed with heat that did not belong to the afternoon. A damp cloth rested on his forehead. His small chest rose and fell too fast, like a horse that had run too far. Victor placed 2 fingers against the boy's neck, counting silently, his brow tightening for just a moment before his expression returned to professional calm. "It is only a fever," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Children are resilient." The sheriff nodded but did not look convinced. Outside, wagon wheels rolled past. Someone laughed. Life continued just beyond the walls of that room, as if nothing had begun to change. Victor prepared a measured dose of medicine, mixing powder into water with exact movements learned through years of training. He spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who had never doubted his own understanding. "This will reduce the temperature." Hours passed. The sun moved lower. Shadows stretched across the wooden floorboards. The brass clock ticked louder in the growing silence. Daniel did not improve. His breathing became more shallow, each inhale a little shorter than the last. Victor checked his pulse again. Slower now. His certainty began to thin, not breaking, but bending. Sheriff Hale stood near the window, hat in his hands, turning it slowly without realizing he was doing it. "Doctor," he said after a long while, "you are sure about this?" Victor answered without looking up. "I am trained for this." But something in his voice had changed. The second dose brought no change. The third seemed to do even less. The room grew warmer, though evening approached. Victor removed his spectacles and cleaned them carefully, buying himself a few seconds he could not explain. Medicine had answers. It always had answers. That was what he believed. Yet Daniel's small hand remained weak in his grasp. From somewhere outside came the distant cry of a night bird. The first lanterns in town began to glow. Sheriff Hale finally spoke the thought neither man wanted to say. "What if it is something else?" Victor did not answer right away. He placed the boy's hand gently back against the blanket. His eyes moved once toward the window, toward the darkening outline of the hills beyond town, where a lone cabin sat unseen by most. Then he straightened slightly, as if pushing that thought away. "We continue treatment," he said. But for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Victor Langford did not sound completely certain of the world he believed he understood. Midnight settled over Red Hollow like a heavy blanket, the kind that made every sound travel farther and every worry feel closer. And inside the small doctor's office, the only steady rhythm was the ticking brass clock and the soft, uneven breathing of a boy who should have been dreaming instead of struggling through the night. The oil lamps burned low, their yellow light trembling each time a draft slipped through the wooden walls. Dr. Victor Langford had removed his coat hours ago, his sleeves rolled carefully to his forearms, his hands moving with the same discipline he had trusted his entire life. Yet every new attempt felt less certain than the last. He prepared another mixture, carefully measuring drops of liquid into a glass cup, watching the surface ripple as if the answer might reveal itself there. Sheriff Thomas Hale had not moved far from his son's side. The strong lines of his face had softened into something quieter now, something more fragile than the badge pinned to his vest. Every few minutes, he placed his large hand gently over Daniel's smaller one, as if reminding himself the boy was still there. Outside, the town had gone still. The saloon piano had stopped hours ago. Even the usual late voices had faded into the distance. Fear had a way of spreading without anyone speaking it aloud. Victor checked the boy's temperature again, his fingers lingering longer than before, searching for a sign he could name, a pattern he could explain. The fever did not break. A bead of sweat ran down the doctor's temple. He did not wipe it away. "Sometimes the body must fight its own battle," he said quietly, though the words sounded more like something he needed to hear himself. Sheriff Hale did not answer. He only watched his son's face, memorizing every detail as if time might try to take it from him. Hours stretched. The clock marked each one without mercy. At some point near 3 in the morning, Daniel stirred slightly, his breathing catching before continuing again, and both men leaned forward at the same time, hope rising too quickly before settling again into uncertainty. Victor stepped back, his thoughts moving faster now, turning through everything he had studied, every lecture hall, every thick medical book, every case he had solved before. This should have been simple. This should have responded. Yet it did not. The silence grew heavier. Finally Victor spoke again, but this time the certainty was gone. "I have done what I know to do." The words hung there, unfinished. Sheriff Hale lifted his head slowly. "And what does that mean?" Victor hesitated. For the first time he did not have a clean answer. "It means," he said carefully, "that sometimes we must wait." The sheriff looked down at his son again. Waiting felt like the longest road a man could travel. A cold wind pressed softly against the window glass. Somewhere beyond the town limits, past the dry fields and quiet hills, a small cabin sat beneath the fading stars where a single lamp still burned. Neither man spoke of it. Not yet. But the thought had begun to exist between them like a door neither one was ready to open. And as the night slowly began to surrender to the faint gray promise of morning, Sheriff Hale realized something he had never faced before, that a badge could command a town, but it could not command the rising of the sun, and it could not command a child's breath. The first gray light of morning had not yet reached the windows when doubt finally spoke out loud in the small doctor's office. Not as an argument, not as a confession, but as a quiet suggestion that refused to disappear. Dr. Victor Langford stood near the table with his hands resting on the edge of the wood, his shoulders lower than they had been the day before, his thoughts moving through everything he had trusted and finding spaces where certainty no longer held. Daniel's breathing remained shallow, each breath spaced by long pauses that made the room hold still. Sheriff Thomas Hale had not slept. His eyes were red from watching, not from tears, but from the long strain of helplessness a man like him had never practiced. Near the back wall, an older woman from town sat quietly, her hands folded over a worn Bible she had not opened, her presence more habit than invitation. She had been the one who finally spoke. "I have seen this before," she said softly, her voice careful, like someone stepping onto uncertain ground. Neither man answered right away. She continued anyway. "Not like this exactly, but sickness that did not listen to doctors." Victor did not look at her. "Medicine is not guessing," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. The woman nodded slowly. "No, but sometimes pride is." The sheriff lifted his head slightly. The words settled into the room like dust. Pride. No one said the name Elias Crow. No one needed to. It was already there. Victor finally straightened, his jaw tightening. We do not turn to folklore because we are tired. The woman did not argue. She only looked at the boy. You do not turn to anything because you are tired, she said. You turn because you love him. Silence followed. The clock marked another minute. Sheriff Hale stood slowly, his joints stiff from hours without movement. He walked to the window and looked out toward the faint outline of the desert hills beginning to show under the paling sky. He remembered the look Elias had given him. Not anger, not fear, something harder to ignore. Certainty without arrogance. The kind of man does not borrow. The sheriff spoke without turning around. If a man was wrong, he said slowly, how does he correct it? Victor did not answer. The question had not been for him. The older woman replied instead. He walks back the same road. Outside, the first bird called to the coming light. Sheriff Hale picked up his hat from the chair where he had placed it hours earlier. He held it for a long moment, then set it back down. His hand moved instead to the silver badge on his chest. He looked at it, not with pride now, but with understanding. Then he unpinned it and placed it beside the hat. No ceremony, no speech, just a choice. Victor watched, but said nothing. Some lessons could not be taught in medical school. Sheriff Hale moved toward the door, pausing only once beside his son to place his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. I will be back, he said quietly, though he did not know what that promise would cost him. Outside, the air carried the cold edge of dawn. A thin trail of dust marked the road leading away from town. And for the first time in many years, Thomas Hale stepped onto that road not as the law, but as a father willing to ask. The horse moved at a steady pace across the pale morning earth, each hoofbeat sounding louder than it should in the quiet, as if the land itself was listening to the decision being carried across it. Thomas Hale had ridden this road many times before, usually with purpose, usually with authority, but never like this. Today there was no badge on his chest, no rifle across his saddle, only the cold weight of uncertainty sitting heavier than any weapon ever had. The sunrise spread slowly across the desert, long rays of gold reaching over the dry hills and turning the dust into something almost beautiful. The kind of beauty a man notices only when he has no control left. His horse snorted softly, breath turning white in the cool air. 5 miles from town, he slowed near a shallow creek bed where cottonwood leaves whispered in the breeze. He remembered the stories people told about Elias Crow, that he listened more than he spoke, that he never asked for payment twice, that he left when told, that he came when called. The memory of his own voice telling that man to leave town sat heavy now. Pride was easy in daylight, harder in the quiet. Another mile passed, then another. The small cabin finally came into view beyond a stand of trees, smoke rising in a thin line from the stovepipe, straight into the still air. Everything about the place spoke of order without wealth. A split-rail fence, a water barrel catching morning light. A saddle blanket hung carefully to dry. Nothing wasted, nothing careless. Thomas dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground with hesitation he would never have allowed another man to see. For a moment, he did not move closer. He simply stood there, hat in his hands now, feeling the strange distance between who he had been yesterday and who he needed to be this morning. The cabin door opened before he could knock. Elias Crow stepped into the light, as if he had known the exact moment Thomas would arrive. No surprise showed on his face. No satisfaction. Only that same quiet presence that had unsettled the town before. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved softly through the grass between them. Finally, Thomas removed his hat completely. Not as a sheriff. As a man. His voice came out lower than he expected. My boy is sick. Elias said nothing. Thomas continued. The doctor cannot bring the fever down. Still silence. The kind that makes a man finish the truth. Thomas swallowed once. I was wrong. The words did not come easy. They rarely did when they mattered. Elias studied him for a few seconds that felt longer than the ride itself. Not judging. Not forgiving. Simply measuring. Then he asked only one question. How long? Thomas answered immediately. Since yesterday afternoon. Elias nodded once, already turning back toward the cabin. Bring clean water, he said. 2 gallons. No lecture. No reminder. No price named. Just instruction. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with relief. He moved quickly to the water barrel without needing to be told twice. And as the sun climbed higher over the desert, the man who had come expecting to ask for help realized he had already begun receiving it the moment the healer chose to answer. The ride back to Red Hollow felt shorter, though the distance had not changed, because when a man carries hope, the miles seem to fold beneath him like paper. Thomas Hale rode beside Elias Crow in silence, the healer sitting straight in the saddle of his old bay horse, a canvas satchel tied carefully behind him, the same worn medicine bundle resting against his side. Neither man tried to fill the quiet. Some roads demanded respect. The sun had climbed a hand's width above the horizon now, warming the land with a gentle certainty that felt different from the cold doubt of the night before. As they approached the town limits, the first signs of morning life began to show. A shopkeeper sweeping dust from his doorway paused mid-motion. A stable boy carrying a bucket stopped walking. Two men outside the mercantile turned to watch without speaking. Word traveled fast in small towns, faster than horses sometimes. The sheriff, returning with the man he had sent away the day before, did not go unnoticed. Thomas saw the looks: curiosity, confusion, a few traces of shame. He did not explain. Elias did not acknowledge them. He simply rode forward at the same calm pace, eyes steady, posture unchanged, as if dignity did not depend on anyone's approval. When they reached the doctor's office, Thomas dismounted first and held the door open without thinking about what that gesture meant. Elias stepped inside without hesitation, bringing with him the faint scent of sage and dry earth. Inside, the room felt smaller than before. Dr. Victor Langford stood near the examination table, exhaustion lining his face, his collar loosened, his perfect order disturbed by a night that had not obeyed him. For a moment the doctor said nothing. His eyes moved from the healer's face to the leather bundle, then back again, calculation and resistance moving quietly behind his gaze. Elias did not wait for permission. He stepped beside Daniel and placed his hand lightly near the boy's chest, not pressing, only feeling the rhythm beneath the skin. His movements were slow, deliberate, practiced through years no school had measured. "Open the window," Elias said quietly. Thomas moved immediately. Fresh morning air entered the room. "Warm water," Elias said next. Victor hesitated half a second, then reached for the kettle himself. Pride bends slowly, but sometimes it bends. Elias opened his bundle and removed small wrapped leaves, crushing them gently between his fingers before placing them into the rising steam. A clean cloth followed. Careful breathing. Patience. No performance. No grand claims. Just attention. The room watched in silence. Even the clock seemed quieter. Minutes passed. Then more. Daniel's breathing changed first, not dramatically, just a small deepening, like a man finally finding the right rhythm after being lost. Elias nodded once, as if confirming something only he had expected. Victor watched closely now, not as a skeptic, but as a student who had not planned to learn today. No one spoke of who had been right. No one spoke of yesterday. Some victories did not require words. As the light filled the room completely, Thomas Hale stood at the foot of the table with his hat pressed against his chest, understanding something no badge had ever taught him, that respect could not be ordered, only earned, and sometimes the strongest man in the room was the one who had never needed to prove it. The change came slowly, the way real healing often does, not with a sudden miracle, but with small signs that only careful eyes would notice, the kind of signs Elias Crow had spent his life learning to see. Daniel's breathing grew deeper, each breath reaching farther into his lungs than the one before, the tight strain leaving his small chest little by little. A faint color returned to his cheeks, not strong yet, but present. Elias replaced the warm cloth across the boy's forehead and adjusted the folded blanket with the same care a craftsman might use repairing something fragile but worth saving. "Do not rush him," Elias said quietly. "The body remembers its way if you do not force it." Dr. Victor Langford stood closer now than he had earlier, watching every motion, not interrupting, not dismissing, simply observing with the humility of a man discovering that knowledge did not belong to one road alone. "What herb is that?" Victor asked after a long silence. Elias answered without looking up. "White sage and desert willow bark." Victor repeated the words softly, as if committing them to memory. Outside, More townspeople had gathered without being invited, drawn by the silent gravity of the moment. No one spoke loudly. Even those who had laughed the day before now stood with hats in their hands, unsure where to look. Sheriff Thomas Hale remained beside the table, his eyes never leaving his son's face, but something in his shoulders had changed. The rigid weight he carried before had begun to loosen, replaced by something quieter, something grateful. After another long stretch of stillness, Daniel stirred again, his fingers moving slightly against the blanket. His eyes opened just a little, unfocused at first, then settling on his father. Thomas did not speak. He simply reached forward and placed his hand gently over Daniel's. That was enough. Elias began packing his medicine bundle without announcement, returning each item to its place with the same quiet discipline he had shown since arriving. No ceremony, no demand for recognition. His work had been to help. Nothing more needed saying. Victor finally stepped forward. "You understood something I did not," he said, his voice honest now, stripped of the distance it once carried. Elias tied the final knot on his bundle. "Different teachers," he replied. Victor gave a slow nod. Some truths did not need debate. Thomas reached into his coat and removed a small leather pouch of coins, offering it without pride. Elias did not take it. "Keep it," he said simply. Thomas hesitated. "Then what do I owe you?" Elias looked toward the open window where the morning sun now filled the room completely. "Remember," he said. That was all. Outside, the gathered townspeople stepped back as Elias walked through them, not pushed aside, but making space without being asked. Respect had arrived without being announced. As Elias mounted his horse, the same boy from the general store who had laughed the day before lowered his eyes. No apology was spoken. None was requested. Some lessons stayed longer when silence carried them. Elias turned his horse toward the open land beyond Red Hollow, the desert waiting with the same quiet patience it always had, and behind him the town stood a little different than it had the day before, though no one could have said exactly when the change began. By late afternoon the town had returned to its usual rhythm, wagons rolling, hammers striking iron, voices carrying across the dry street. Yet something quieter had settled beneath it all, something that did not announce itself, but stayed anyway. Inside the sheriff's office, Daniel now slept with the deep, steady breathing of a child whose body had remembered how to be strong again. The fever had broken like a storm that had finally spent itself.